The Oil for Food Program, established by the United Nations in 1995, was established to allow Iraq to sell oil on the world markets in exchange for food, medicine, and other humanitarian needs for ordinary Iraqi citizens without allowing Iraq to boost its military capabilities. The program was introduced by United States President Bill Clinton's administration in 1995, as a response to arguments that ordinary Iraqi citizens were inordinately affected by the international economic sanctions aimed at the demilitarization of Saddam Hussein's Iraq, imposed in the wake of the First Gulf War. The sanctions were discontinued on November 21, 2003 after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and the humanitarian functions turned over to the Coalition Provisional Authority. The program was de jure terminated in 2003 and de facto terminated in 2010. Although the sanctions were effective, there were revelations of corruption involving the funds. Background and design: the Oil for Food program was instituted to relieve the extended suffering of civilians as the result of the comprehensive sanctions on Iraq from the UN, following Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990. Security Council Resolution 706 of August 15, 1991 was introduced to allow the sale of Iraqi oil in exchange for food. Security Council Resolution 712 of September 19, 1991 confirmed that Iraq could sell up to $1.6 billion in oil to fund an oil for food program. After an initial refusal, Iraq signed a Memorandum of Understanding in May 1996 for arrangements to be taken for the implementation of that resolution. The Oil for Food program started in December 1996, and the first shipments of food arrived in March 1997. 60% of Iraq's 26 million people were solely dependent on rations from the Oil for Food plan. The program used an escrow system. Oil exported from Iraq was paid for by the recipient into an escrow account possessed until 2001 by BNP Paribas Bank, rather than to the Iraqi government. The money was then apportioned to pay for war reparations to Kuwait, ongoing coalition and United Nations operations within Iraq. The remainder, the majority of the revenue, was available to the Iraqi government to purchase regulated items. The Iraqi government was permitted to purchase only items that were not embargoed under the economic sanctions. Certain items, such as raw foodstuffs, were expedited for immediate shipment, but requests for most items, including such simple things as pencils and folic acid, were reviewed in a process that typically took about 6 months before shipment was authorized. Items deemed to have any potential application in chemical, biological or nuclear weapons systems development were not available to the regime, regardless of stated purpose. Financial statistics: over $53 billion worth of Iraqi oil was sold on the world market. About $46 billion of these funds were intended to provide for the humanitarian needs of Iraqi people such as food and medicine in the context of international economic sanctions. A considerable amount was spent for Gulf War reparations through a compensation fund. UN administrative and operational costs for the program and costs for the weapons inspection program. Internal audits have not been made public. And of the program. Shortly before United States and British forces invaded Iraq, UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan suspended the program and evacuated more than 300 workers monitoring the distribution of supplies. On March 28, 2003, Secretary-General Annan, the United States, and Britain asked the Security Council to ensure that nearly $10 billion in goods Iraq ordered and already approved, including $2.4 billion for food, could enter the country when conditions allow. The resolution under discussion made clear that the chief responsibility for addressing humanitarian consequences of the war would fall to the United States and Britain if they took control of the country. This refers to the 1949 Fourth Geneva Convention on the Responsibilities of the Occupying Power. On May 22, 2003, UN Security Council Resolution 1483 granted authority to the Coalition Provisional Authority to use Iraq's oil revenue. The program's remaining funds of $10 billion were transferred over a 6-month winding-up period to the Development Fund for Iraq under the Coalition Provisional Authority's control. This represented 14% of the program's total income over 5 years. The program was formally terminated on November 21, 2003, and its major functions were turned over to the Coalition Provisional Authority. Abuse. In addition to criticism of the basic approach, the program suffered from widespread corruption and abuse. Throughout its existence, the program was dogged by accusations that some of its profits were unlawfully diverted to the government of Iraq and to UN officials. These accusations were made in many countries, including the US and Norway. Benon Sevan of Cyprus, who headed the program, defended it, claiming that it had only a 2.2% administrative cost and that it was subject to more than 100 audits, blaming restrictions from the Security Council for making the situation difficult. He also claimed that 90% of Iraq's population relied on the program for its monthly food basket. While Benon Sevan was in charge of the program, he stonewalled efforts to review and investigate the program. He ordered his staff that complaints about illegal payoffs should be formally filed with a whistleblower's country, making them public and allowing Iraq to bar any whistleblowers. In 2000, Dilip Nair, the UN corruption watchdog, wanted to determine the program's level of vulnerability. Sevan, along with UN Deputy Secretary-General, Louise Frechette, rejected any such investigation, claiming that it would be too expensive to be worthwhile. Iqbal Rizan ordered the shredding of years' worth of documents in his office concerning the program. He clarified that this concerned a working file with copies of documents received by his office, which had to be purged due to a lack of space. The originals were held elsewhere. In response to these criticisms, and evidence acquired after the 2003 invasion of Iraq, UN Secretary-General accusations were made that skimmed profits were being used to buy influence at the UN and with Kofi Annan himself. According to an interim report released on February 3, 2005 by former Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker's commission, much of the food aid supplied under the program was unfit for human consumption. The report concluded that Sevan had accepted nearly $150,000 in bribes over the course of the program, and in 2005 he was suspended from his position at the United Nations as a result of the investigation of fraud in the program. Peter van Walsum, the now retired ambassador of the Netherlands to the United Nations and chairman of the Iraq Sanctions Committee from 1999 to 2000, speculated in a recent book that Iraq deliberately divided the Security Council by awarding contracts to France, Russia, and China but not to the United Kingdom and the United States. He also stated he encountered a number of cases in which he felt the lack of Iraqi cooperation was designed to exacerbate the suffering of its own people. He also claimed that it was his opinion that the sanctions were not an effective deterrent. Until 2001, the money for the Oil for Food program transited through the BNP Paribas Bank, whose main private shareholder is Iraqi-born Nadhm Orchi, a man estimated to be worth about $1 billion according to Forbes, and ranks 13th in Britain according to The Guardian. Orchi received a 15-month suspended sentence for his involvement in the ELF scandal, which has been qualified by the British newspaper as the biggest fraud inquiry in Europe since the Second World War. ELF became a private bank for its executives who spent £200 million on political favours, mistresses, jewellery, fine art, villas and apartments. ELF, an oil company, merged with Total Finer to become Total SA in 2003. Almada list one of the earliest allegations of wrongdoing in the program surfaced on January 25, 2004, when Almada, a daily newspaper in Iraq, published a list of individuals and organizations alleged to have received oil sales contracts via the UN's Oil for Food program. The list came from over 15,000 documents which were reportedly found in the state-owned Iraqi Oil Corporation, which had close links to the Iraqi Oil Ministry. Named in the list of beneficiaries were George Galloway, then a British Member of Parliament, and his charity, the Mariam Fund. Former French Interior Minister Charles Pasqua and Shaker al-Khafaji, an Iraqi-American businessman, India's Foreign Minister, Natwar Singh, was removed from office because of his role in the scandal. Many prominent Russian firms and individuals were also included on the Almada list. Even the Russian Orthodox Church was supposedly involved in illegal oil trading. The former assistant to the Vatican Secretary of State, Reverend Jean-Marie Benjamin, is said to have received rights to sell 4.5 million barrels. George Galloway subsequently won 2 libel actions against the Christian Science Monitor and Daily Telegraph, which reported the allegations. The president of Olexco Limited, Arthur Milholland, whose name also appeared on the Almada list, denied any wrongdoing, but confirms the charges that illegal surcharges were being paid to the Iraqi government by contractors. However, the Almada list does not discuss bribes paid to Iraq. It discusses bribes paid to individuals so that they would support Iraq. Few deny that in Iraq, like in many third world countries, bribes and kickbacks were regularly paid to the leadership in order to get contracts, but some suggest that kickbacks would normally not occur in such countries when a UN-run program was involved. Operation of the scheme. The scheme is alleged to have worked in this way: individuals and organizations sympathetic to the Iraqi regime, or those just easily bribed, were offered oil contracts through the Oil for Food program. These contracts for Iraqi oil could then be sold on the open world market, and the seller was allowed to keep a transaction fee, said to be between 15 cents and 50 cents per barrel of oil sold. The seller was then to refund the Iraqi government a certain percentage of the commission. Contracts to sell Iraq humanitarian goods through the Oil for Food program were given to companies and individuals based on their willingness to kick back a certain percentage of the contract profits to the Iraqi regime. Companies that sold commodities via the Oil for Food program were overcharging by up to 10%, with part of the overcharged amount being diverted into private bank accounts for Saddam Hussein and other regime officials, and the other part being kept by the supplier. The involvement of the UN itself in the scandal began in February 2004 after the name of Benon Sevan, executive director of the Oil for Food program, appeared on the Iraqi Oil Ministry's documents. Sevan allegedly was given vouchers for at least 11 million barrels of oil, worth some $3.5 million in personal profit. Sevan has denied the charges. BNP Paribas. The sole bank handling funds transfers for the Oil for Food program was the New York branch of the Banque Nationale de Paris Paribas, or BNP Paribas. This French bank was the sole bank administering the $64 billion UN program. An investigation by the U.S. House Committee on International Relations found that BNP Paribas made payments without proof that goods were delivered, and sanctioned payments to third parties not identified as authorized recipients. Investigators estimate that the bank received more than $700 million in fees under the UN program that began in 1996 and ended after the ousting of Saddam in March 2003. DILFA report. The Iraq Survey Group, which was tasked with finding evidence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, found that OFF saved the Iraqi economy from decline after the imposition of sanctions. Furthermore, the Iraqi regime found that it could corrupt OFF to get hard currency that could be used to manipulate the Iraq Sanctions Committee and undermine sanctions as well as increase arms. The final official version of the Iraq Survey Group report cites only France, Russia and China as violators who paid kickbacks. According to the report, the top 3 recipients of oil included Russia, France, and China, which are on the UN Security Council. The U.S. received 2.3%. The U.S. recipients included ExxonMobil Corporation, Chevron Texaco Corporation and El Paso Corporation. The list of U.S. companies were originally censored by CIA lawyers, citing privacy issues, but was later leaked. On June 5, 2007, the German chapter of the anti-corruption organization Transparency International lodged a complaint with the German Federal Ministry of Economics and Technology against 57 German companies for allegedly paying $11.9 million in kickbacks in the United Nations unregistered trademark Oil for Food program in Iraq. Oil coupons as bribes. The U.S.-funded satellite network Al-Hurra broadcast a story on January 6, 2005 detailing allegations that Saddam's regime had bribed news reporters with oil coupons. Reporters named include Ahmed Mansour of Al Jazeera and Hamida Nana, a writer based in France and known for her pro-Saddam slant. 2 types of oil coupons were used: silver coupons that entitled holders to 9 million barrels of oil, and gold coupons that were worth more. Hamida Nana is said to have received a gold coupon. Ingersoll Rand pays $2.5 million in fines for kickbacks. In October 2007, the SEC brought a case against Ingersoll Rand that 3 different subsidiaries paid kickbacks to Iraqi government officials. Ingersoll Rand's German subsidiary ABG, subsidiary IR Italiana and the Irish subsidiary Thermo King paid kickbacks characterized as after-sales service fees, but no bona fide services were performed. Ingersoll Rand, without admitting or denying the allegations in the Commission's complaint, consented to the entry of a final judgment permanently enjoining it from future violations of Sections 13b, 2a, and 13b, 2b, of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, ordering it to disgorge $1,710,034 in profits, plus $560,953 in pre-judgment interest, and to pay a civil penalty of $1,950,000. Ingersoll Rand is also ordered to comply with certain undertakings regarding its FCPA compliance program. Ingersoll Rand will also pay a $2,500,000 fine pursuant to a deferred prosecution agreement with the U.S. Department of Justice, Fraud Section. Complaints by Kurds. The Kurds had complained since the start of the program that they were not being paid their fair share of the oil revenues. According to the guidelines set up by the Oil for Food program, the revenues were to be divided up in such a way as to protect Iraq's predominantly Kurdish regions. The allegations include claims that the Cairo office of the UN's World Health Organization, run by an individual alleged to have received oil sales contracts, managed to stall the building of a new general hospital for the Kurdish city of Sulaymaniyah, even though the funds for the project had been available since 1998. Potential Annan link. On June 14, 2005, 2 1998 memos surfaced that appeared to link Kofi Annan to Kotikna Inspection SA. The first one described a meeting between Annan and Kotikna while the company was bidding on the program, after which the company raised its bid. A second one mentioned that Kotikna was confident that they would get the bid due to effective but quiet lobbying in New York diplomatic circles. The source of the documents was a Kotikna executive. The second interim report by the IIC confirmed that Kotikna won the Oil for Food contract fairly and based on merit. The committee concluded that there was no link between Kofi Annan and the award of Kotikna's contract. And Kotikna has been transparent and cooperative through this investigation. Alleged involvement of Russian intelligence. According to high-ranking Russian SVR defector Sergei Chtyakov, the Oil for Food program was sabotaged by an undercover Russian intelligence officer Alexander Kramar who worked in the UN. Kramar set up the artificially low oil prices in 1998 to allow Saddam to use the oil vouchers as lucrative bribes. The difference between the market price and the artificial price was pocketed by people who received the vouchers from Saddam. Among the bribed were top officials from Russia, France, and China. The biggest part of vouchers of oil went to 46 individuals or organizations in Russia, including Russian Orthodox Church. They pocketed $476 million. Among Russians who received the money were Alexander Voloshin and Vladimir Psirinovsky. Sergei Isakov, a buddy of Voloshin, carried bags with money from Moscow to Baghdad to return some of the earned money as kickbacks to Saddam. Alleged use for Al-Qaeda financing. The scandal engulfing the United Nations Procurement Department and the Oil for Food program allegedly involved Al-Qaeda finance operations. Fox News broke the story that Alexander Yakovlev, a Russian official in the UN Procurement Department, was involved. He later resigned and pled guilty to corruption charges. One link was to Ahmed Idris Nasreddin, a man designated as a terrorist financier by the US and the UN. The Union has named Nasreddin as a man belonging to or affiliated with Al-Qaeda. Petra Navigation Group was a company that was on the blacklist of firms blocked from doing business with the US for sanctions-busting activities designed to help Saddam's regime. Allegations against George Galloway. The U.S. Subcommittee on Investigations claimed that British Member of Parliament George Galloway, among others, was the recipient of approximately $600,000 of illegal oil kickbacks from the Iraqi regime. During testimony before the committee on May 17, 2005, Galloway stated that the charges were false and part of a diversionary smokescreen by pro-Iraq war U.S. politicians designed to deflect attention from the theft of billions of dollars of Iraq's wealth that had occurred under the post-invasion Coalition Provisional Authority. A later October 25, 2005 report prepared by the subcommittee's majority staff claimed to have evidence that Galloway was false or misleading during his Senate testimony, and further that his then-wife received some of the kickbacks. A second new element to the accusations is the subcommittee's claim that former Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz, in prison since early 2003, has verified them. However, Aziz's lawyer Badia F. states, "These are lies." He denied this. Galloway continues to deny wrongdoing and challenged the former subcommittee's chairman, Senator Norm Coleman, to charge him with perjury. Oil for wheat equals. A report by UN investigator Paul Volcker, released in October 2005, found that the Australian Wheat Board, later AWB Limited, was the biggest single source of kickbacks. In exchange for trouble-free disembarkation of wheat purchased under the Oil for Food programme, the Australian Wheat Board paid trucking charges totaling $300 million to Alia. Alia is a real Jordanian trucking company, but one with no role in the distribution of Australian wheat in Iraq. Alia kept a small percentage of charges, and passed the remainder to Saddam's government. The AWB was fully compensated for the charges by increases in the price paid. The payments were approved by the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. The Australian government commissioned Judge Terence Cole to further investigate whether Australian companies had indeed paid kickbacks to the Saddam regime. The Cole inquiry commenced in December 2005. The Cole inquiry has received testimony from senior Australian government officials, including Prime Minister John Howard, Deputy Prime Minister Mark Vaile, Foreign Minister Alexander Downer and various officials from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. During the course of the inquiry, numerous AWB officials have resigned, including Managing Director Andrew Lindberg. In 2009, the Australian Federal Police ended the investigation related to the scandal. Investigations GAO investigation After the 2003 invasion of Iraq and subsequent coalition victory over the Iraqi army, the Government Accountability Office was given the task of finalizing all oil for food-related supply contracts made with the now-defunct regime, as well as tracking down the personal fortunes of former regime members. During the execution of this task, the GAO found weaknesses in the program that allowed kickbacks and other sources of wealth for Saddam Hussein. The GAO estimates that the Saddam Hussein regime generated $10.1 billion in illegal revenues. This figure includes $5.7 billion from oil smuggling and $4.4 billion in illicit surcharges on oil sales and after-sales charges on suppliers. The scale of the fraud was far more extensive than the GAO has previously estimated. A U.S. Department of Defense study, cited by the GAO, evaluated 759 contracts administered through the Oil for Food program and found that nearly half had been overpriced, by an average of 21%. Unlike the 661 committee, members of the Security Council had the authority to launch investigations into contracts and to stop any contract they did not like. The British and the Americans had turned down hundreds of oil for food contract requests, but these were blocked primarily on the grounds that the items being imported were dual-use technologies. To quote the GAO report, in its summary, both the UN Secretary-General, through the Office of the Iraqi Program, and the Security Council, through its Sanctions Committee for Iraq, were responsible for overseeing the Oil for Food program. However, the Iraqi government negotiated contracts directly with purchasers of Iraqi oil and suppliers of commodities, which may have been one important factor that allowed Iraq to levy illegal surcharges and commissions. Joseph A. Christoff, Director of International Affairs and Trade at the General Accounting Office, told a House hearing that UN auditors had refused to release the internal audits of the Oil for Food program. Benin Savan, with support from Kofi Annan, had written letters to all former oil for food contractors asking them to consult Saddam before releasing any documents to GAO or U.S. congressional inquiry panels. Throughout its history, the program had received both complaints from critics saying that it needed to be more open and complaints from companies about proprietary information being disclosed. The United Nations has denied all requests by the GAO for access to confidential internal audits of the Oil for Food program. While attempting to determine the complexity of the Oil for Food program for articles in the Wall Street Journal, investigative journalist Claudia Rossett of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and the Hudson Institute discovered that the UN treated details such as the identities of oil for food contractors, the price, quantity and quality of goods involved in the relief deals, and the identities of the oil buyers and the precise quantities that they received as confidential. The bank statements, the interest paid, and the transactions were all secret as well. Rossett has come under harsh criticism from Dennis Halliday and Benon Sevan, who have claimed that many of Rossett's claims were incorrect. The U.S. House Committee on International Relations investigated the Oil for Food program and discovered that money was provided by Sabah Yassin, the former Iraqi ambassador to Jordan, to pay the families of Palestinian suicide bombers between $15,000 to $25,000. From September 2000 until the invasion of Iraq, the families of Palestinians killed or wounded in the conflict with Israel received over $35 million. It is alleged that this money came from the UN Oil for Food program. Independent Inquiry Committee After initial opposition to an investigation, UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan stated on March 19, 2004 that a full independent investigation would be launched. In an official press interview, Annan said, "It is highly possible that there has been quite a lot of wrongdoing, but we need to investigate and see who is responsible." 0:03. However, Annan was emphatic that most of the claims were outrageous and exaggerated, and that most of the criticisms had to do with things over which the program had no authority. The following individuals were chosen in April 2004 to head the United Nations Independent Inquiry Committee: Paul Volcker, former United States Federal Reserve System Chairman and Director of the United Nations Association of the United States of America; Mark Pyth of Switzerland, an expert on money laundering in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development; and Richard Goldstone of South Africa, former prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. On April 22, 2004, the United Nations Security Council passed a unanimous resolution endorsing the Volcker inquiry into corruption in the United Nations Oil for Food program for Iraq, calling upon all 191 member states to cooperate. The definitive report was presented by Paul Volcker to the Security Council on September 7, 2005. A leaked internal UN audit, which surfaced on mineweb.com, shows massive discrepancies between Cotecna reports and UN agency reports for the value of the shipments into northern Iraq. The audit found that Cotecna did no value inspections on nearly $1 billion worth of aid shipments for the interagency humanitarian program into northern Iraq. However, in a subsequent report published by the Independent Inquiry Committee, it was concluded that there were no major complaints by the United Nations or its member states about Cotecna's performance, and that the audit did not report any deficiencies in Cotecna's inspections. Benon Sevan was briefed in December 2002 on the findings of the audit. The audit is available here. Its summary states, OIO's overall conclusion is that the management of the contract has not been adequate and certain provisions of the contract had not been adhered to. In addition, the incorporation of additional costs, such as rehabilitation of camps in the man-day rate, was an unacceptable arrangement. Also, the contract had been amended prior to its commencement, which was inappropriate. OIP needs to strengthen its management of contracts, and the procurement division should ensure that the basis of payment is appropriate in order to avoid additional costs to the organization. After reading the leaked audit, Congressman Henry Hyde wrote to Kofi Annan wondering why the U.S. Congress which provides 22% of the UN's budget and which has publicly requested copies of the 55 internal audits should be required to depend on media leaks for source documents. Interim report results. In a 219-page initial report, the Volcker Commission documented how OIF Chairman Benon Sevan used his position to solicit and receive allocations of oil from Iraq during the years he oversaw the humanitarian relief program. Internal records from SOMO, as well as interviews with former Iraqi officials involved in illicit oil deals, show that Sevan had requested and received allocations of 7.3 million barrels of oil on behalf of a Panama-registered trading company called African Middle East Petroleum Company. Although the report makes no specific allegations of criminal activity by Sevan, Volcker does not rule out the possibility that charges might be filed by authorities in countries with relevant jurisdiction. The report called Sevan's conduct ethically improper, noting that Sevan had received large cash payments totaling $160,000 each year he had headed the program. Sevan claims the money came from an aunt in Cyprus who has since died, but the panel found no evidence to back this claim. Volcker also reported in January that a review of 58 confidential UN internal OIF audits showed UN officials ignored early signs that humanitarian goods shipped to Iraq before the 2003 invasion war were given little if any inspections by the Swiss company Cotigna. However, Volcker concluded in October 27, 2005 IIC report that the audit did not report any deficiencies in Cotigna's inspections. Cotigna paid Kojo Annan, Kofi Annan's son, consulting fees until November 2003. Volcker said that future reports would deal with questions regarding Kojo Annan. Investigations by Iraqi Governing Council International accounting firm KPMG had been selected by the Iraqi Governing Council to investigate the Almada claims, along with Freshfield's Bruchhorst-Stieringer. It was due to release its findings to the Iraqi Governing Council in May 2004. However, in June 2004, KPMG stopped working on the project because it was owed money by the IGC. The U.S. has been harshly critical of the KPMG probe led by associates of Ahmed Shalabai, accusing it of undermining the main probe established by Paul Bremer. That probe had been run by the head of Iraq's Independent Board of Supreme Audit, Ihsan Karim, with assistance from Ernst & Young. The Board of Supreme Audit is within the Iraqi Finance Ministry. In June 2004, Karim's investigation agreed to share information with the Volcker panel. However, on July 1, 2004, Karim was killed by a bomb magnetically attached to his car. Claude Hanks Delsma, a British national and longtime friend of Ahmed Shalabai, was appointed by the IGC to coordinate its investigation of the Oil for Food program. Delsma testified in front of the U.S. Congress that the KPMG investigation is expected to demonstrate the clear link between those countries which were quite ready to support Saddam Hussein's regime for their own financial benefit, at the expense of the Iraqi people, and those that opposed the strict application of sanctions and the overthrow of Saddam. He also testified that Shalabai was in charge of the investigation for the IGC. In late May 2004, on the same day that Shalabai's offices at the Iraqi National Congress were raided by coalition forces, Delsma claimed that an individual or individuals hacked into his computer and deleted every file associated with his investigation. He also claimed that a backup data bank was also deleted. When asked by Claudia Rosset if he had been physically threatened as well, Delsma replied with no comment. Delsma has also been an outspoken critic of the UN's refusal to release any internal oil for food audit information to the IGC. Beneficiaries. Russia, according to the paper The Beneficiaries of Saddam's Oil Vouchers, the list of 270 Russian beneficiaries included, the Russian state €1,366,000,000 barrels, Zarubezhneft €174,500,000 barrels, the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia €79,800,000 barrels, Lukoil Company €63 million barrels, Rosneft €35,500,000 barrels, Vladimir Putin's Peace and Unity Party €34 million barrels, Yatumin, Gazprom €26 million barrels, Soyuz Tegaze euro 25,500,000 barrels, the Moscow Oil Company euro 25,100,000 barrels, Onoco euro 22,200,000 barrels, Sidanko euro 21,200,000 barrels, the Russian Association for Solidarity with Iraq euro 12,500,000 barrels, the son of the former Russian ambassador to Iraq euro 19,700,000 barrels, Nikolai Rizhkov euro 13 million barrels, Rosneftsport euro 12,500,000 barrels, Transneft euro 9 million barrels, the Ural Invest Company euro 8,500,000 barrels, Sineft euro 8,100,000 barrels, Stroyneftegas euro 6 million barrels, the Rus. Com for Solidarity with the People of Iraq euro 6,500,000 barrels, the Russian Orthodox Church euro 5 million barrels, the Russian President's Office Director euro 5 million barrels, the Moscow Academy of Sciences euro 3,500,000 barrels, the Chechnya Administration euro 2 million barrels, the National Democratic Party euro 2 million barrels, the Nordwest Group euro 2 million barrels, Yukos euro 2 million barrels, Russian MFA euro 1 million barrels, Mashinoimport euro 1 million barrels, Slaveneft euro 1 million barrels, the Caspian Invest Company euro 1 million barrels, the Russian Communist Party euro 1 million barrels, Tatneft euro 1 million barrels, Sigutneft euro 1 million barrels, Siberia's Oil and Gas Company euro 1 million barrels. Other beneficiaries, Austria, the Arab-Austrian Society euro 1 million barrels. Belarus, Liberal Party euro 1 million barrels, the Communist Party of Belarus euro 1 million barrels, Brazil, the Revolutionary Movement October 8, a Brazilian communist group euro 4,500,000 barrels, Canada, Arthur Milholland, President and CEO of the Oilexco Company, FR Yugoslavia, the Yugoslav Left Party euro 9,500,000 barrels, the Socialist Party euro 1 million barrels, the Italian Party euro 1 million barrels, Kokstamsha euro possibly Coast Unicus Party euro 1 million barrels, other parties, the Romanian Labour Party euro 5,500,000 barrels, the Party of the Hungarian Interest euro 4,700,000 barrels, the Bulgarian Socialist Party euro 12 million barrels, the Communist Party of Slovakia euro 1 million barrels, France, the French Arab Friendship Association euro 15,100,000 barrels, former French Interior Minister Charles Pasqua euro 12 million barrels, Patrick Morgane, the Trafigura Company euro 25 million barrels, Michel Grimard, founder of the French Iraqi Export Club euro 17,100,000 barrels. Egypt, Khaled Gamal Abd al-Nasser, son of the late Egyptian president euro 16,600,000 barrels, Imad al-Ghalda, a businessman and a member of the Egyptian parliament from President Mubarak's National Democratic Party euro 14 million barrels, Abd al-Azim Manaf, editor of the Sat al-Arab newspaper euro 6 million barrels, Mohammed Hilmi, editor of the Egyptian paper Sawhat Misra euro an undisclosed number of barrels. The United Arab Company euro 6 million barrels, the Nile and Euphrates Company euro 3 million barrels, the Al-Multak Foundation for Press and Publication euro 1 million barrels. Libya, Prime Minister Shagri Ghanem euro 1 million barrels, India, the Indian National Congress euro 1 million barrels, Indonesia, Indonesian President Megawati Sukarno Putri euro 1 million barrels, Italy, the Italian Petrol Union euro 1 million barrels, West Petrol, an Italian company that trades crude oil and oil products euro 1 million barrels, Roberto Formigoni, possibly the president of Lombardia euro 1 million barrels, Salvatore Nicotra, an oil merchant euro 1 million barrels, Myanmar, Myanmar's forestry minister euro 1 million barrels, Palestine, the Palestinian Liberation Organization euro 4 million barrels, the PLO. Political Bureau euro 5 million barrels, Abu al-Abbas euro 11,500,000 barrels, Abdullah al-Harani euro 8 million barrels, the PFLP euro 5 million barrels, Wafa Tawfiq Al-Say euro 4 million barrels, Qatar. Qatari Horse Racing Association Chairman Hamad bin Ali Al Thani euro 14 million barrels, Gulf Petroleum euro 2 million barrels, Spain. Bassem Kaikh, a member of the Spanish Committee for the Defense of the Arab Cause euro 1 million barrels, Ali Balout, a pro-Saddam Lebanese journalist euro 1 million barrels, Javier Robert A. euro 1 million barrels, Syria. Faraz Mustafatlas, the son of Syrian Defense Minister Mustafatlas euro 6 million barrels, Order Moran euro 18 million barrels, Ghassan Zakariya euro 6 million barrels, Anwar al-Aqad euro 2 million barrels, Hamid Annana, the owner of the Al-Wifaq al-Arabi periodical euro 1 million barrels. Switzerland. Glencore, the largest commodity trader in Switzerland euro 12 million barrels, Taurus Petroleum euro 1 million barrels, Petrogas, which is listed under three sub-companies euro Petrogas Services, Petrogas Distribution, and Petrogas Resources euro, and is associated with the Russian company Rosneftgaztroy euro 1 million barrels, Alcan, listed in Liechtenstein and associated with larger oil companies euro 1 million barrels, Fina Holdings, which is listed in Lugano, Switzerland, and is under liquidation euro received 1 million barrels, Ukraine, the Social Democratic Party euro 1 million barrels. The Communist Party euro 6 million barrels. The Socialist Party euro 1 million barrels. The FTD Oil Company euro 1 million barrels, as did other Ukrainian companies. United Kingdom, George Galloway euro 1 million barrels, Fosrelight euro 1 million barrels. Srelight also appears in the Jordanian section as having received 6 million barrels, the Mujahideen Khalq euro 1 million barrels. United States, Samir Vincent, organized a delegation of Iraqi religious leaders to visit the U.S. and meet with former President Jimmy Carter euro 10,500,000 barrels, Shaker al-Khafaji, the pro-Saddam chairman of the 17th Conference of Iraqi Expatriates euro 1 million barrels. Other beneficiaries were companies and individuals from the Sudan, Yemen, Cyprus, Turkey, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Pakistan, Romania, the UAE, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Panama, Thailand, Chad, China, Nigeria, Kenya, Ireland, Bahrain, and the Philippines, as well as two Saudi Arabian companies. Criminal investigation in France. The French criminal justice system is investigating alleged involvement of two former officials from the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Jean-Bernard Mar copyright Rima copyright and Serge Boudveix. The two are accused of having used their extensive network of connections in the Arab world in order to commit influence peddling, and corruption of foreign public agents. They have been put under formal criminal investigation by investigating magistrate Philippe Couroy, a famous specialist in cases of corruption and other financial dealings. Both men had retired at the time of the alleged crimes and acted in their personal capacity, not as official envoys of the French government. However, Boudveix claims that he kept the Ministry of Foreign Affairs informed of his actions in Iraq. The ministry claims to have warned both men formally in 2001. Some other people, including Bernard Guillet, an aide to French Senator Charles Pasqua, are also under formal investigation. Guillet and Pasqua deny any wrongdoing. U.S. Senate investigations. U.S. Senator Norm Coleman called for Kofi Annan to resign over the scandal and held a number of hearings on the matter. The most spectacular of these hearings occurred after the subcommittee released a report that accused British Member of Parliament George Galloway, Russian politician Vladimir Tsirinovsky, and former French Interior Minister Charles Pasqua of receiving oil allocations from Iraq in return for being political allies of Saddam Hussein's regime. Galloway, in an unusual appearance of a British MP before a U.S. Senate subcommittee, responded angrily to the allegations against him in a confrontational public hearing which drew much media attention in both America and Britain. Galloway denied the allegations. It is estimated that as much as $10 billion to $21.3 billion went unaccounted for and all was directed to Saddam Hussein and his government in the form of kickbacks and oil smuggling. Record-keeping of illegal behavior is hard to come by and rare at best. To date, only one of 54 internal UN audits of the Oil for Food program have been made public. The union has refused all requests for its audits. Warren Hodge alleged that the American government was aware of the scandal and chose to not prevent the smuggling because their allies Turkey and Jordan benefited from the majority of the smuggled oil. U.S. Senator Carl Levin is quoted in an interview for the New York Times as saying, "There is no question that the bulk of the illicit oil revenues came from the open sale of Iraqi oil to Jordan and to Turkey, and that was a way of going around the Oil for Food program, and that we were fully aware of the bypass and looked the other way." Indictments. On January 6, 2006, South Korean businessman Tong-Sun Park was arrested by the FBI in Houston after he was indicted for illegally accepting millions of dollars from Iraq in the UN Oil for Food program. The criminal charges against him were unsealed in a U.S. District Court in Manhattan. After an investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation's New York field office, on January 16, 2007, Benin Savan was indicted by prosecutors from the Southern District of New York for taking about $160,000 in bribes. Michael J. Garcia, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, issued a warrant through Interpol for the arrest of Savan at his home in Cyprus, as well as a warrant for Ephraim Fred Nadler, a New York businessman who was indicted on charges of channeling the illegal payments to Savan. Nadler's whereabouts are unknown. Daimler AG kickbacks case. On April 1, 2010, Daimler AG plead guilty to bribery charges brought by the U.S. Justice Department and the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission and will pay $185 million as settlement, but remains subject to a 2-year deferred prosecution agreement and oversight by an independent monitor. The German automaker of Mercedes-Benz vehicles was accused of violating the terms of the United Nations Oil for Food program with Iraq by including kickbacks 10% of the contract values to the Iraqi government. The SEC said the company earned more than $4 million from the sale of vehicles and spare parts. The SEC case was sparked in 2004 after David Bazzetta, a former auditor at then Daimler Chrysler Corporation, filed a whistleblower complaint after he was fired for raising questions about bank accounts controlled by Mercedes-Benz units in South America. Bazzetta alleged that he learned in a July 2001 corporate audit executive committee meeting in Stuttgart that business units continued to maintain secret bank accounts to bribe foreign government officials, though the company knew the practice violated U.S. laws. The investigation for the case also revealed that Daimler made some $56 million in bribes related to more than 200 transactions in 22 countries that earned the company $1.9 billion in revenue and at least $91.4 million in illegal profits. Using offshore bank accounts, third-party agents and deceptive pricing practices, these companies, Daimler AG and its subsidiaries, saw foreign bribery as a way of doing business, said Mithili Raman, a principal deputy in the Justice Department's Criminal Division. It is no exaggeration to describe corruption and bribe-paying at Daimler as a standard business practice, Robert Kyozami, director of the SEC's Enforcement Division, said in a statement. Judge Richard J. Leon of United States District Court in Washington, approved the plea agreement and settlement, calling it a just resolution. See also, Iraq sanctions, economy of Iraq, management of Iraq reconstruction program, oil for food program hearings, fuel versus food, oil price. And notes. Dilfer, Charles. Iraq Survey Group. Comprehensive report of the Special Advisor to the DCI on Iraq's WMD. Washington, D.C. Central Intelligence Agency. ISBN 0-16-072492-9. Retrieved November 2, 2011. External links. Sites http iraq-offp.org. A independent inquiry into the United Nations Oil for Food Programme, Resolution 986 authorizing the Oil for Food Programme Union Office of the Iraq Programme. Oil for Food Facts. A website of the UN Foundation, an independent UN political booster organization. Source Watch on Oil for Food Programme, http www.burdfordmani.com. Republic of Iraq. Vowel HTML Articles 2007, Europatica, Oils for Food. A Euro scandal in the Iraq. Transparency. Germany inserts complaint against 57 German enterprises. Tell Nation, Oil for Food scandal, the Houston-based defendants, 2005, Putting Oil for Food in Perspective, Jurist, November 2, 2005, Oil for Food, a shared failure. A Euro still a long way to go, Transparency.org, October 27, 2005, UN 2,200 companies gave Iraq illicit funds, Nick Wadhams and Edith Lederer, Associated Press, Yahoo News, October 27, 2005, Financial Times, January 13, 2005, U.S. ignored warning on Iraqi oil smuggling, CNN.com, documents, U.S. condoned Iraq oil smuggling, February 2, 2005, BBC, April 15, 2005, Row deepens over UN oil scandal, The Guardian, May 17, 2005, U.S.-backed illegal Iraqi oil deals, Alternet, October 4, 2005, Kofi and the Scandal Pimps, Le Monde, October 13, 2005, M. Boydvik's orator copyright en contact constant avec le Quai d'Orsay, 2004, The UN Oil for Food Scandal. A Euro Washington Times. March 2004, BBC, March 19, 2004, Galloway accepts libel damages, Jean David Levitt, Los Angeles Times, April 7, 2004, First Freedom Fries, Now Oil for Food Lies. Op-ed of French Ambassador to the U.S., Claudia Rosset, commentary, May 2004, What did Kofi Annan know, and when did he know it? Hanks Delsma Connections to Shilabai, May 2004, The UN is Us, exposing Saddam Hussein's silent partner U.S. complicity in the oil smuggling. Harper's Magazine, December 2004,